I'm Peter Higgins. I'm the chairman of the NEC4 Contract Board.
Hi, I'm Heaphy, a member of the NEC4 Contract Board. Peter, we've received a number of questions through to the NEC in relation to the COVID-19 outbreak, and so we thought it would be useful to discuss some of those and share a response from an NEC perspective.
Ian, we have another question that's been raised. If option X2 is included in the contract, it talks about the law. What law does it apply to? What is the law? Which law is it?
Yeah, when you look at X2, it reads as it's the law of the country where the site is. So that is the important law in respect of X2. So it's not necessarily the law of the contract. You could have a contract under the law of England and Wales, but the actual site is in another part of the world, could be in Hong Kong, could be somewhere in Europe or Middle East. And it'll be the law of that country where the site is that is relevant when considering X2.
Okay, how does that work with plant and materials which are manufactured for the project in another country? Does that cause a problem? Would that be part of the site?
The site is going to be the actual physical location of the site. The site's a defined term. We have the site identified and the boundaries of the site identified in the contract data. So that is what is going to apply in terms of the law in relation to X2. If there are problems due to the supply of plant and materials from another country, then that could be addressed under other clauses in the contract, other provisions such as prevention, such as clause 17, as we looked at before, in terms of illegal or impossible requirements caused by difficulties in the supply chain.
But certainly it wouldn't come under X2 changing the law. That's correct.
No. Yeah, X2 is limited to the law of the country where the site is, not the governing law of the contract, though that in itself may create its own issues as we've discussed.
Thank you very much, Ian. Ian, we've had another question about compensation, and the question is really, why do we, in clause 60.119, which deals with the consequences of prevention, why do we allow for both time and money? A lot of other contracts just allow for time.
Yeah, I guess when you look at other more traditional contract forms, we have a force majeure provision, which is similar to what prevention is trying to cover in the NEC contracts. In those contracts, very often, if a force majeure event occurs, the contractor will get time but no money. I think the idea being that the parties share that risk because it's nobody's fault, nobody can prevent it. It's this type of act of God situation. NEC, we have a general policy that all compensation events entitle the contractor to claim both time and cost effects. The view being that those are interchangeable, they're too interrelated to try and separate them out. And also I think the big thing with prevention under the NEC is that the project manager is the person who has the power to decide how best to deal with the event. So by giving the project manager the power to decide what's best for the client and giving instructions to that effect, we feel it's therefore appropriate that the client then takes on the time and cost effects that flow from that. If we were to leave it in a more traditional approach of you get time but no money, then the contractor is going to look at an option which is lowest cost to them. They're not going to want to expend money to try and recover delay or to try and look at alternative ways of keeping the production going if they're not going to get paid anything additional for that. Whereas if they're getting time, then they may look to actually take as long as possible or to almost maximize delay because they will recover that and they will get relief from liquidated damages if they apply under the contract or general damages for a delay. So by giving the project manager the power to decide the course of action, deciding whether it is more appropriate to try to recover delay, we have it all together in a single package, time and cost being dealt with together. That way we have the contractor being able to take on board those actions and knowing they will be compensated for the effects.
In fact, it must be very difficult, wouldn't it, for the project manager to be able to instruct the contractor what to do, and yet the contractor only be compensated for time. That couldn't work, could it?
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's the real issue for me, is that we give the project manager the power to make that decision. Therefore, the client has to take on the responsibility for that decision. Otherwise, it's going to be open-ended as to who actually decides what's best to do. Other contracts, it may be that there's a difference of opinion between the contract administrator and the contractor over the best course of action. And you get into a claim situation, you get into a dispute situation where they're both sort of pointing the finger at each other over what the appropriate course of action should be. Here, it's very clear cut. The project manager decides, contractor obeys, but the consequences will be compensated.
Okay, thank you. Now, an associated question. There's a client who's looked at the clause 19 and the compensation, and they said, really, I don't want to get involved in this one. I just want the contractor to sort it out. So I've deleted clause 19 of the contract. I've removed the compensation event for that particular event. That makes it the contractor's responsibility, doesn't it? I can sleep happily at night.
Well, on the face of it, yeah, you would say that that risk has now been transferred to the contractor. It's not grounds for a compensation event. Therefore, the contractor takes the risk of force majeure type events occurring, what we in NEC call prevention. But I think it's not as simple as that. There's other aspects to consider. Certainly, if you have X2 in the contract, it may well be that if it's the requirements of law that are impacted as a result of the COVID-19 outbreak, then they themselves may be compensation events. And so it may still come back to being a compensation event under client's risk if X2 is being selected. Also, going back to the earlier point around the project manager having the power to instruct how to deal with the issue, if you don't have the compensation event for prevention, you've potentially also deleted the ability to give an instruction, or if instructions are still given, then that's likely to then be classed as a change to the scope in terms of if you're going to bring in additional requirements, constraints, restrictions, then that could well be a change in scope and a compensation event. If the project manager gives an instruction to stop or not start any work, again, that would be a compensation event. So there may be other results, other events that lead to compensation events through the project manager wanting on behalf of the client to take control of the process. If not, we may get back into the situation again we just touched upon, where the project manager doesn't give an instruction, the contractor chooses what they want to do, which may not be in the client's best interest. So you may well find the project manager having to step into the breach here, having to give instructions, which in themselves would be classed as compensation events.
So from what you're saying, if a client removes clause 19 and the equivalent compensation event, they're doing themselves a pretty massive disservice. They've lost the ability to control what's going on. They're probably going to still have some significant requests for additional payment from the contractor, who probably can't afford to take the risk anyway. And everything seems to be the wrong way around. So if they're going to have compensation event arising anyway, they can't control what goes on. What was the benefit? Why would they have done that?
Yeah, I think people just take a more traditional view, and I do know some clients who have amended the contract to make prevention either time only or to remove it. But again, this comes back to the issue then that who then decides what is the best course of action, who then decides what should be done. And you may very quickly get into a disagreement around what is the appropriate course of action. It may be through the early warning process, you can still come up with an agreed way forward. You can look to mitigate the costs. There may be some ways to deal with this where it has less impact, less significance, but we can clearly see this is becoming a major issue and having a substantial impact on everybody's daily life and on construction. Therefore, there's going to have to be actions taken to decide the best course of action. They'd be much better to be done under the heading of prevention, under the clause given the appropriate powers. Otherwise, it may well end up as either being an argument over, well, the project manager recommends a course of action, the contractor chooses to ignore it. What happens then? Or the project manager has to give an instruction, which, as I say, would probably be a compensation under other provisions of the contract. So, yeah, it does seem to be you're losing something by removing clause 19 and prevention from the contract.
Okay, so try to transfer the risk by removing clause 19. You probably don't really transfer the risk, at least not fully, and you lose an awful lot in the time of doing so. So not a good idea, Mr. Client.
Yeah, I think, it is there for a reason and a rationale. I guess you could possibly see in some sort of turnkey approach where it was the contractor had the majority of the design, was deciding to do the work, had a lot of freedom, that maybe you could look to transfer the risk more in those situations. But it's still really going to be a difficult situation because ultimately the client wants the asset, wants the thing to be built, and therefore is going to require that power to decide the best course of action if these type of events occur. I think it's also worth bearing in mind that if you look to some of the main options as well, some of that risk will be shared regardless. So if you're looking at options C and D, where you have a target cost contract, then the cost the contractor incurs in dealing with delays, maybe recovery of time, additional costs in protecting the site or having to mothball and restart, would form part of defined cost and would be payable. Okay, it may lead to pain share, reduced gain share, so the contractor's contributing towards it, but so is the client. And if you're working under option E, then the client will take that risk anyway. So it becomes even more strange to delete prevention under option E, where you have the financial risk sitting with the client anyway.
Okay, thank you.